What's up, everybody? Welcome back to class. Okay, this lecture is going to be the first of a several part kind of series of lectures all about JFK, or John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. Now, he's a pretty interesting guy, and I think he goes down as probably one of the most well-known and recognizable presidents for a variety of reasons. I think he's a super interesting guy personally, and I'm gonna kind of sort of do what I did with Teddy Roosevelt as far as a couple part series where I explain his life and the impact that he had on the country. Now, in my personal opinion, Teddy Roosevelt, like I said, he's got a soft spot in my heart for him, that he is probably my personal favorite president. But JFK is probably even more well known, and a big part of that is his untimely death, the assassination. He was the fourth of four different presidents that have been assassinated in American history, and of course, his is the only one. It's the most recent and the only one that was caught on video. So we will spend some time on that, the JFK assassination. That'll be coming up, but he is the guy that had the makings to be, I think, an epically great president, a transformational president. But he was only president for 3 years. He gets assassinated at the end of his first term in office when he was just starting to campaign for re-election. So, I don't know that, I don't think he did have as much of an impact as a guy like Teddy Roosevelt or FDR. But he may have if his life hadn't have been cut short. Anyway, like I said, he's an interesting guy, and I want to start from the beginning of his story and kind of go over the family background first. So this first part of this lecture series is really just going to hit on his family background and his just coming in and starting to enter politics, kind of up to the beginning of his presidency. So a lot of it, here's the thing, in the 3 years that he was president, a lot of big things happened in terms of the civil rights movement and the Cold War. So then I'm going to go on and break down some of the big events and cover those more thoroughly in detail, and eventually tell you kind of what his role was and how events unfolded. But kind of starting from the beginning here. So the Kennedys. Oh, let me move my face here so that you can see the whole family photo. He comes from a very wealthy and powerful family. JFK would have never had to work or enter politics. His family was incredibly wealthy. So kind of a similarity between the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. Now, the Roosevelts had been in America much, much longer than the Kennedy family. The Kennedys, if you don't know, Kennedy, the last name, it's an Irish last name. So they're descendant from Irish immigrants that came over in, I think, kind of the mid to late 1800s. Now, JFK and all of his brothers and sisters were born here in America. His parents, who are both descendant of Irish immigrants too, obviously, were born in America. But I believe it was like his grandfather had immigrated over to America. They originally, when the Klan first came over, they were kind of average people that were not super wealthy. But actually, the Kennedy family, they made their fortune during the Prohibition era. So that's kind of a little known fact about them, that it was actually like JFK's dad, Joe Kennedy Sr., made a bale of money through bootlegging whiskey. All right. So, the Irish tradition, or kind of a stereotype about the Irish, is that they love whiskey and fighting and stuff, and they're feisty people. Think of like Conor McGregor or something. Anyway, that's not obviously true of all Irish people, but typically Irish culture, like most Irish people are Catholics, and a lot of them do enjoy their Guinness or their whiskey and that kind of stuff. So they definitely would have looked at it like, morally, that's not like an important thing to abstain from drinking. Anyway, so, Prohibition had great intentions, but it really has a lot of unintended consequences, as we had covered back in like Q1 or early Q2, where by making alcohol illegal, that doesn't really make anybody stop drinking, but what it does do is lead to a huge rise in organized crime. Guys like Al Capone making, he's probably the most successful gangster in American history that makes, in today's money, like $1 billion off supplying the city of Chicago with alcohol. Now the Kennedys were not as wealthy as like Al Capone. They weren't that big, and I don't think they were that ruthless either. At least I've never heard any stories to make me think that. But they did make a ton of money trying to bootleg alcohol into. Sorry, I got my puppy joining me. She is a huge fan of JFK, so you're going to see the top of a puppy head here for a few minutes. Anyway, they made a bale of money by basically bootlegging in whiskey, and I think it was in kind of the Boston or East Coast area, and that was how they made their family fortune. Well, Joe Kennedy Sr., and if you follow my cursor here, here is the old man himself. That's the Kennedy father. And then here's their mother, Rose Kennedy. After he makes a ton of money doing that, he decides the real power and the real important jobs are getting into politics. So he uses some of his family fortune to basically finance some campaigns, and he's a very successful politician. He becomes a U.S. senator, and later he ends up becoming an ambassador to England. Now, one of the things about people that were Catholic, especially from back in this era, the Catholic Church said that birth control is immoral and didn't believe in using birth control, and they wanted to have very big families, be fruitful and multiply, right? So you can see that by the Kennedy family. There are 9 brothers and sisters, a huge family, by today's standards, very massive. Now, it was more common back at that time, and it was kind of tradition that a lot of Catholic families did have lots of children, right? If you remember the lecture that I did, or talking about some of the stories about my grandpa Stan. Now, his dad was from Poland and moved over here, but they were also a very devout Catholic family. Well, my grandpa Stan, who served in Patton's army, he was also one of 9 brothers and sisters, and is basically from that same generation as the Kennedys. Okay, of course, not as famous or politically influential, but very normal for Catholic families to have a lot of kids back in this era. I guess Joe Kennedy was a super ambitious guy, and he pushed really, really hard and could kind of be a jerk. At least a lot of the stories I've heard about him would make me think that. One of the stories I had heard about him was that Rose Kennedy, after she married him, she had second thoughts, some buyer's remorse. And I guess before they had any kids or anything, she went back to her parents and said, I made a huge mistake. I can't be married to this guy. I don't like him. I hate him. And her parents said, well, we're Catholic, and once you get married, that's that. There is no way out till death do us part. So go back to him and make it work. Well, they figured out a way to make it work. And I guess, I don't know that they had the most happy marriage, but a committed relationship, and they're together until Joe Kennedy dies many decades later. And they end up having a lot of kids. So there's 9 total, and you can see them all there in the photo. Here is the oldest son, Joseph Jr. Okay, Joe Jr. He was often called Joe Kennedy. Same name as the dad. Over here on this side, if you follow my cursor, that's young JFK. And then here is Bobby Kennedy, and here's Ted Kennedy. Now, all of them, the dad had huge political ambitions for him. And he really very much, a goal he had early on, because he ends up becoming a pretty powerful senator. And then while the Nazis are rising to power in the 1930s, he's the ambassador to England. So a very powerful and influential guy. And he definitely wanted some or all of his sons to carry on that tradition and to enter politics. His plan was to have Joe Kennedy Jr., his oldest son. The aspirations were there, and the hopes and dreams were that he was going to be president. That was one of his goals, to have one of his sons be president someday. Now you might think, well, what about the daughters? Well, it was very uncommon for girls to enter politics back in that era. Just a more sexist culture, I guess. So that he didn't even look at as an option. But he thought one of his boys, his goal was get them up to that top office in the land. Joe Jr., from everything I've ever heard of him, sounds like he was a pretty decent guy. I actually think he had a better personality and was probably on his way to being a more honorable and honest guy than his dad was. However, both JFK and the oldest son, Joe Jr., were of age during World War II and were going to serve in the military. And back then, most politicians, if there was a war going on and you had political aspirations for the future, you probably should serve. Now, that has become less common as history's gone on. Most of our recent presidents don't have military experience. But you go back 100 years ago, a lot of the presidents and top politicians politicians did serve if there was a war happening when they were young men. So only the two oldest brothers serve in World War II. They're the only two that were old enough to at the time. Now, Joe Jr. is serving as a pilot in the airborne over in a base in England, and he's working on. I think wanted to be a fighter pilot, but also flew bomber planes. So he's over there fighting the Nazis. Now JFK is the second boy of the family, the younger brother. He ended up serving out in the Pacific, fighting against the Japanese, and he was on a small PT boat, they call him, where he was, I believe, the captain of a small PT boat, not a battleship, but a tiny little boat that is out there, fighting against the Japanese Navy. And his ship had the misfortune of getting hit by a Japanese torpedo one night, and the ship sinks, and it's a disaster. And I guess JFK, from all the accounts I've ever read, he was especially heroic. He did what he did in swimming and like getting the life raft out, and he rescued a few of the guys' lives. They were lost at sea for a while, but he kept their hopes up. But apparently he single-handedly probably saved a few of the guys on his crew. And because he's from the Kennedy family and his dad's a well-known politician, that throws him into the media spotlight. And that's kind of front page news for a minute that, the war is going on. That's what people are focusing on. But hey, this one, Joe Kennedy's son, ends up being a war hero. He saved some guys out there in the Pacific, and that made JFK kind of the most well-known of the children in the family at that time in the era. Well, the plan was for his older brother, Joe, to be the one that was going to enter politics. And he was the one that Dad was planning on would eventually run for president someday. Well, that put pressure on Joe Jr. And he felt like, man, my little brother is outshining me. I need to do something to make a name for myself. I need to be a war hero. So he starts to sign up for some very dangerous, high-risk secret missions. And apparently, I don't know all the ins and outs of this story, but he was going to fly a bomber plane on a top secret mission, and it was loaded with explosives. And I'm not 100% sure exactly what he was doing, but he was going to go do this secret mission to go bomb the Germans, and something horrible went wrong. And when the plane was in air, the bombs ignited, it blew up, and everybody on the plane, including Joe Jr., dies as the plane explodes. So horrific thing that he kind of was pushing himself because he wanted to make a name for himself. He felt that pressure because his younger brother had kind of outshone him during the war years. And anyway, if he had not had that pressure on him, I don't know that he would have been volunteering for missions like that. But anyway, that's the end of Joe Jr. He dies kind of a war hero during World War II, and now the dad moves on and is going to look at JFK. The hopes and dreams of the family's political future are now falling on the second son. Now, Joe Jr. is Joe Sr., the Kennedy father, is a very, very driven, kind of stern man that is incredibly ambitious. Honestly, a lot of the stories I hear of him, he doesn't sound like a great guy, or the guy that you would want to be maybe your father. He brought a lot of money and wealth and influence, but man, he pushed his kids very hard. To give you another story about him that can kind of maybe shed a little bit of light onto who he was as a person. One of the Kennedy daughters, and I'm not sure which one it is in this photo, she was kind of a party girl and was rebelling and would go out and hang out and smoke and drink and hang with the guys. And Joe, the dad, was worried that she would basically lead the family into scandal and would give them a bad reputation. So he actually signed her up and made her get a lobotomy when she was a young woman. Now, if you've never heard of that procedure, it's because they don't do it anymore because it's humane. But for people that were hysterical or way out of line, she would have not qualified for this. She was just kind of a rebellious young girl. But essentially, a surgeon will go up in through your nose and separate the front part of your brain from the rest of the brain. That's what a lobotomy is. And it pretty much, the procedure makes you a vegetable. It kind of ruins your brain, and you can't cognitively act or behave like normal people that had not had that procedure done. So she ends up living a very long life, but is basically in a wheelchair and cared for in kind of in a like a vegetative state, you'd say, for the rest of her life. So, man, when I heard that story, I'm like, wow, what a rotten thing. I can't imagine doing that to one of my children just because they were acting out and misbehaving and, maybe partying a little bit too much. But that was the kind of guy he was. He had a goal, and his goal was to be the dominant force in American politics, and that he couldn't get to the presidency himself, but he was hell bent on having one of his sons achieve that. It would give him more sway too. Now, uh, JFK, as soon as World War II ends, he basically immediately enters politics, and his dad is pushing him to do that and funding his campaigns. He becomes a congressman. I think he was one of, if not the youngest congressman in American history. Now, there may be some others that have gotten achieved that younger than he did, but he was in like his late 20s. I believe he was like 27 or 28 when he first gets elected into the House of Representatives. That's pretty impressive. The minimum age to be elected to the House of Representatives is 25, and the vast majority of congressmen are up in their 50s or 60s, if not 70s. So anyway, he gets elected, and he is like a baby-faced young guy entering Congress. He doesn't stay there very long. He ends up getting then elected to the Senate when he's in his early 30s, and the minimum age to get into the Senate is 30 years old. So he was in there almost as soon as you could and serves a couple terms as senator from Massachusetts. And then once he had built up his reputation enough, by the time he is kind of like in his early 40s, I want to say he was 43 or 44, that's when he ends up running for president. Now, I had already covered the election of 1960 on a previous chunk of notes. That's kind of a notable election for a lot of reasons because it's the first one with a televised presidential debate. So I'm not going to get in and recap all that because I've already covered it. When he gets elected, though, I did say that JFK kind of, and I'll try to move my mugshot out of the way, is like a new kind of politician. A lot of the newspapers and the media at the time, you look at the presidents before him, all the other presidents up to him in the 1900s, they're all kind of old, stuffy white dudes. A lot of them are bald. They don't look like JFK. He looks more like an actor or a movie star of some sort. He's tan. He has a good head of hair. He's younger. He, at least by presidential standards, he's very young. He has a young family. There had not been little kids living in the White House since Theodore Roosevelt was there in the first decade of the 1900s. So that's a big shift when the media is now covering. We have kind of this glamorous, youthful, really good-looking president who's smooth on camera. He's a rock star style president. Anyway, they nickname in the media his administration, they call it Camelot, which if you've never heard of Camelot before, that's the mythical kingdom in like the story of like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Lancelot and Lady Guinevere. Okay, it's a famous play. They've made movies about it, but it's kind of old, Middle Ages like mythology where Camelot was supposed to be this perfect, idealistic old Middle Ages kingdom. So they start calling the Kennedy administration Camelot because in a lot of ways, people look at him like as this new style of president that is just like too good to be true. He's like American royalty. However, behind the scenes, his personal life was often tumultuous. And he does have some shortcomings as a guy. I think overall, JFK was probably a pretty decent dude from what I know about him. But man, he really liked the ladies. He had many extramarital affairs. Home life with him and his wife was often tense. There was a lot of tragedies that also kind of mark their family life. Like he has 4 children, and 3 of them end up dying untimely deaths. 2 die like in infancy, and then the other one actually dies after JFK was assassinated. But he was John Jr., Kennedy's son that did survive to adulthood, he dies in a horrific plane crash when he's like a young man, kind of in the 1990s. So a lot of people would say, man, the Kennedy family seems almost like cursed. And I'll get into that a little bit more down the road when we wrap things up. But the Kennedy family almost does did attract a lot of bad luck in different ways. On the one hand, they were super fortunate in a lot of respects, but man, many of the Kennedy family members end up dying untimely deaths. So overall, the last thing I want to leave you with, he is like a pop culture type icon and also president at the same time. He is very popular with the American people, even though the election he won was super close. A lot of people questioned him and thought, man, maybe this guy is too young. He doesn't have enough experience. Is he going to be able to stand up to the Soviets? That's kind of his weak spot, I guess. But he was seen as very strong on civil rights, in that he was a smooth speaker and just a reasonable, rational guy. And he is beloved by a lot of the American public. So we will pick up again probably tomorrow, where I'm going to start getting into some of the big events that happened during his 3 years as president. And boy, there are some doozies. So I'm going to break it up into chunks, and we'll cover one event and just do some mini lectures that'll be about 10 minutes long. So hopefully you're finding this story interesting so far. I think it really picks up and gets even more interesting from here on out.